Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Christian Navarro-Torres, and I'm honored to join you today for the CIRS IBD Summit. This presentation is sponsored by Envirobiomics, and together we're going to be exploring an often overlooked environmental factor, endotoxins. You'll see how these hidden exposures from endotoxins impact the gut, the brain, and chronic conditions like IBD and neurodegeneration. Most importantly, we'll talk about how you can begin to identify and test for endotoxins in your own environment. So for this video, we're going to be answering four main questions. What are endotoxins? Why do they matter in CIRS and beyond? How do they impact the gut and the brain? And finally, what are the practical steps to determine whether endotoxins are impacting you? Let's start with some basic definitions and concepts just to make sure we're all on the same page, starting with what is chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CIRS. CIRS is a prolonged innate immune response triggered by toxins produced by certain microbes, including certain fungi, molds, and bacteria that are most commonly found in the interior of water-damaged buildings. In people who are suffering from CIRS, inflammation just doesn't shut off the way that it should or the way it does for the majority of people. In fact, we know that there's a genetic basis for this faulty immune response in relation to biotoxins. We have an estimated 20 to 25% of the population of the US who may carry a genetic susceptibility to developing at some point this dysregulated immune response where you see hyperactivation in terms of innate immune inflammatory activity that doesn't resolve. On the other hand, you have a relatively silent adaptive immune response that's supposed to be in charge of tagging the toxins and removing them safely from your body. So there's a miscommunication between these two sides of the immune system that at some point in these people's lives is going to turn on, and it won't turn off on its own unless it's treated properly. We've always known that mold was one of the triggers for this illness that we call CIRS. But as new research has come out, especially in the last 7 to 10 years, it's becoming increasingly clear that there's also bacteria, certain bacteria that grow in these water damaged settings that are also critical contributors. And at the heart of that are endotoxins. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So what are endotoxins? Well, endotoxins, also called lipopolysaccharides or LPS, are found in the outer membrane of gram-negative bacteria. When these gram-negative bacteria die, endotoxins are released into the air, the water, and dust. Endotoxins are heat stable. They resist breakdown, meaning they linger around long after the bacteria is gone. And in high concentrations, endotoxins can behave almost like a gas, penetrating indoor spaces very easily. Endotoxins are most commonly found in wastewater sources, including things like sewers, plumbing leaks, dried out drains, septic tanks, flooded areas, water treatment plants, livestock farms, and even recycled water. These are all potential reservoirs that can expose communities and households to endotoxins. Many familiar pathogens produce endotoxins, so you might recognize species such as E. coli and Salmonella, right, which are often associated with foodborne exposures or food poisoning, right, from rotten food or just food that has become cross-contaminated with a water source that has these bacteria that produce endotoxins. But you can also have species such as Klebsiella and Haemophilus, which are more classic upper respiratory infections that can also produce endotoxins. Then you can have species in the Pseudomonas category, which are going to be often found in soils or water damaged settings or plants. Then you have species such as Bacteroides or Proteus, which are actually commensal or relatively neutral bacteria that you'll find in the intestinal tract, but they can become pathogenic or infectious in certain settings. In fact, the Proteus species can cause UTI very commonly or often. And then you have the Porphyromonas, right, which are oral commensals that can eventually cause gum disease. And in fact, you'll see those types of bacteria in people with Alzheimer's disease. The key point here is that endotoxins are not rare. They're widespread across the bacterial kingdom. So there are two main paths or routes of exposure. One path is inhalational, right? So we go into an environment where there's a lot of endotoxin activity and we breathe in all these endotoxins, right? It could be from dust, it could be from aerosols, from wastewater or sewer gas that you're smelling, right? And then you can have the upper respiratory infections as well, where they could be producing localized endotoxin activity. And then we have the ingestion route, which is going to include things like food poisoning, and we already alluded to that. And that's going to fall more in the acute episodes, right, of exposure. But then you're going to have versions that are going to look more chronic, including people who develop leaky gut. And I hope to showcase in the next few slides that there is an important connection between leaky gut and elevated endotoxin activity in the digestive tract. And as part of that complex of ingestion, of course, you're going to have things like gum disease. And as I already alluded to, there are several gram-negative bacteria that when they're present in high amounts in the gum, that seems to predict certain neurodegenerative diseases. Now, for the remainder of this presentation, I want to focus on these environmental sources of endotoxin exposure that we breathe in and how that seems to impact the digestive tract in CIRS patients. And the reason for this is that the primary concern in terms of primary routes of exposure for CIRS patients is going to be inhalational. When you go into an environment that there's large amounts of endotoxins that you're breathing in, over time, experiencing that repeatedly, it could take years for some patients, that's going to cause all this elevated inflammation that doesn't turn off on its own, and over time that's going to have downstream effects on inflammation in the digestive tract. So maybe we want to exploit a little bit that relationship. I want to start by saying that endotoxins are a health hazard for humans, period. Meaning, it doesn't matter if you have CIRS or if you're someone that doesn't have CIRS or any illness associated with the environment. We know that endotoxins are a health concern in general, and there's a lot of research that has been published over decades documenting these associations between endotoxin exposure and human health concerns. And the reason for this is because humans are uniquely sensitive to endotoxins. We've evolved to develop a very specific hyperinflammatory response the moment that the body senses any kind of endotoxin activity running into the bloodstream. Just to put this in context, a healthy human gut can hold up to 1 gram of endotoxins, meaning when your gut is healthy, it is designed to withstand a lot of this and not let the endotoxins escape into the bloodstream. But even 1 milligram in the bloodstream can trigger septic shock, meaning it can be fatal, right? And as little as 1 nanogram injected into the bloodstream can alter mood, motivation, and cognition, right? So there are studies, human studies, where people have been injected with tiny traces of endotoxins into the bloodstream, and that actually induces depression and symptoms of anxiety and cognitive dysfunction and social dysfunction, right? So you can see how powerful even small amounts of endotoxins can be once they cross from the gut into the bloodstream. On top of that, research shows that endotoxins are consistently elevated in the blood in Alzheimer's patients compared to healthy controls. And animal studies demonstrate loss of neurons and memory decline that's consistent with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's pathology. This literature connects environmental exposures directly to neurodegenerative disease pathways. In addition, we have work by Dr. Shoemaker and his colleagues suggesting that endotoxins may be the primary drivers of accelerated brain injury and brain atrophy in CIRS patients. And in fact, the work by Dr. Shoemaker and his colleagues suggests that about 28% of patients suffering from CIRS are thought to primarily suffer from endotoxin exposures. That makes endotoxins the second most common driver of immune dysfunction in CIRS patients. And this is why testing beyond mold matters a lot. So what I'd like to do now is give you a mechanistic breakdown of how endotoxin exposure in the context of CIRS can create conditions where there will be a lot of inflammatory activity in the gut that can then lead to things like IBD, right? So starting from the top, we have inhalation of endotoxins that are going to trigger cytokine storms, and this just means a lot of that inflammatory activity from the innate immune system as your first line of defense in the mucosal linings of your sinuses and upper respiratory tract, right? So we're focusing on all of this here. And this is going to have an immediate impact on two brain regions that I'm highlighting and zooming in here that are very susceptible to this cytokine activity, namely the pituitary gland, which is this part here, and the hypothalamus, right? And these regions are really important for regulating your body, regulating your hormones, regulating your circadian rhythm, regulating your sense of pain, regulating your sense of sleep, your menstrual cycles, right? Your motility, your response to stress. All these things are regulated by these tiny regions in the brain. So you can think of them as regulating centers for the body. The pituitary gland particularly sits outside the blood-brain barrier, meaning it's directly exposed to all this cytokine activity that's going to be coming in from all that exposure from endotoxins. Now, in a healthy immune system, perhaps a person that doesn't suffer from CIRS, you may have an initial inflammatory response to these endotoxins coming into the body. But what will happen pretty quickly is this other part of the immune system, the adaptive immune system that's responsible for tagging the toxins and clearing them, removing them safely from the body, that will happen for those people, right? So that ongoing chronically elevated cytokine activity is not going to be present for them. But for CIRS patients or people who are susceptible to developing CIRS, there's going to be inefficient endotoxin clearance, and this is going to lead to a persistent, stubborn cytokine activity. Now, over time, this persistent cytokine activity is going to start chronically elevating certain biomarkers that are directly associated with innate immune activation. In other words, with inflammation from the innate immune side, right? One of those markers is called MMP9, and this is one of the biomarkers that we typically test for when looking to make a diagnosis for CIRS. So MMP9 becomes chronically elevated, and when this happens, this now creates conditions for what we call a leaky blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is the mucosal tissue that protects your brain from all kinds of foreign invaders, toxins, and even activity from the immune system, because the brain is such a delicate and sacred space and organ for your body, right? So the blood-brain barrier has this very tightly controlled wall that selectively allows for certain things to enter. But when MMP9 becomes chronically elevated, we have a leaky blood-brain barrier, meaning now things from the bloodstream can cross very easily into the brain and cause all kinds of problems. At the same time, this persistent cytokine activity that's directly bombarding the pituitary gland, that's very exposed and vulnerable, is going to over time deplete these core and foundational immune modulating hormones. One of those hormones is called alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone, or MSH. The majority of CIRS patients, well over 90% of patients, develop some kind of MSH deficiency or complete depletion of MSH. And this is going to create a long list of symptoms that are going to impact different systems, including sleep disturbances, chronic pain, erratic menstrual cycles, fertility problems, motility problems, and inability to clear mucosal colonizations or infections, and even histamine problems in the form of mast cell activation syndrome. One of the core functions of MSH is to regulate inflammatory activity from the immune system, particularly innate immune activity. So when we have a loss of MSH, we are more prone to having consistently elevated inflammation in the mucosal linings, including the gut. So when this happens, we start running into issues with the gut, meaning loss of mucosal integrity, in other words, intestinal permeability and leaky gut. Now, on top of all of that, we already mentioned that inhaled endotoxins are not going to be effectively removed from the body in people who have this genetic susceptibility for CIRS, right? Which means there's going to be indefinite recirculation of endotoxins between the liver and the gut, right? The only way we know to stop that problem is when patients start using cholesterol sequestrant medications like cholestyramine or Welchol, which binds to the bile acids where the endotoxins are contained. It forces the endotoxins out via stool. But before that, patients are going to be susceptible to this indefinite recirculation of endotoxins between the liver and the gut. And in the context of having low MSH, what that means is that endotoxins can easily cross from the gut into the bloodstream. And remember that we mentioned that it only takes a very small amount of endotoxins crossing into the bloodstream to trigger this hyperinflammatory activity from the innate immune system, right? On top of that, having high MMP9, which we already also mentioned, means that endotoxins can go from the bloodstream into the brain because the blood-brain barrier is also leaky. Meaning, right, we have a very, very permeable body all over the place, and that creates conditions where endotoxins don't stay in the gut. The gut is hyperinflamed, and on top of that, some of that inflammation is spilling over into the bloodstream and making its way into the brain. And so what we have here really is a vicious cycle of perpetuating cytokine activity between the brain and the gut, and this is how you create a profile of systemic inflammation in these two core areas that we often see in CIRS patients. In fact, there is plenty of literature outside CIRS that has already documented endotoxemia as a common feature of patients that are suffering from IBD, right? And when we say endotoxemia, we're referring to elevated levels of endotoxins in the bloodstream. And there are several studies that have documented this, and that elevation is actually directly correlated with the level of disease or the severity of the disease for IBD. Now, coming back full circle here, there is literature out there suggesting and proposing that MSH may have a critical protective role against inflammatory activity in the gut, including IBD. And now we can see this critical and delicate correspondence and relation between what's going on in the brain in terms of inflammatory activity driven by what you're breathing and how that has a downstream effect in the gut, right, when we have low MSH, and then how the inflammatory activity from recirculating endotoxins in the gut can project all the way back up into the brain, and you have this vicious cycle. And you can see how IBD patients may very well suffer systemically from low MSH and inflammation in the hypothalamic and pituitary regions, and how resolving that inflammatory activity in the brain may be a critical step in order to start addressing these inflammatory insults in the gut that include IBD. So what can you do as a CIRS or IBD patient in order to regain control over your health? We know that the first and most important step in treating CIRS is removing yourself from biotoxin exposure. Starting with removing yourself from the most extreme version of that, which would be water damage exposure. And then making sure that biotoxin activity is within safe levels. This includes your home and your workplace. We know that it is possible to treat CIRS and put it into remission. We also know that healing a highly inflamed gut is possible through CIRS treatment. But all of this depends on you being in a safe environment that allows your immune system to recalibrate, restore that MSH, and turn off the chronic inflammation in the gut and in the brain. As a CIRS patient suffering from IBD, dust testing for endotoxins is one of the best and most efficient ways to identify whether your home or workplace is contributing to endotoxin burden. Envirobiomics offers a test called test number 5, or endotest, which will measure endotoxin activity in the environment. I'm showing you here a sample report on the right side, and the results are very straightforward. For CIRS patients, levels under 100 endotoxin units per milligram are generally considered safe. Levels above 200 endotoxin units per milligram are considered a hazard for anyone, regardless of whether you have CIRS or not. One thing that I want to point out here is that when you purchase an endotoxin test, you will have the option to choose how quick you would like the test results to be sent back to you, anywhere from 5 business days all the way down to within a 24-hour cycle. So if you're someone that's on the hunt for an apartment, you're looking to rent, and you need to make a quick decision about whether this place is good for you or not, you can certainly choose a 24-hour cycle, provided that it is on a business day. Here are some tips on how to collect dust samples for endotoxins. First, you want to rely on using the dust cloth that's sent to you by Envirobiomics, and preferably wear some gloves as you're doing the collection. You want to try, ideally, to swipe about 10 different areas. Focus on areas with undisturbed historical dust. These areas can include places such as tops of doors, tops of window frames, high shelves and cabinets, picture frames, lampshades, nightstands, and HVAC returns. Wipe in one direction only per area. The more visible dust that you see in the cloth, the better. Avoid collecting dust from the floor, and avoid sampling from sinks or cabinets under the sink directly. Usually our focus with endotoxin testing is indoors, especially if we know there's a history of plumbing issues, broken pipes, problems with the toilet, or dried out drains. Those are all good reasons to proceed with an indoor endotoxin test. But the reality is that sometimes endotoxin activity can be coming from outside, from a nearby source that's creeping into the indoor space. If you think you're in this category, you might want to consider doing outdoor sampling in addition to indoor sampling to compare both of them, especially if indoor endotoxins come back high, but you cannot trace the source to an indoor problem. Or if you experience outdoor sewer gas smell, that's another example. If you live near a water treatment plant within a mile radius, let's say, if you live near ongoing major construction like a big building with open pipe construction, if you live near a farm with livestock or frequent manure practices, or if you've had a history of flooding in that neighborhood, or if your community uses recycled water for irrigation. All of these strongly warrant suspicion for possible ongoing or active endotoxin exposure beyond the indoor space. Where do you collect outdoor samples? Well, you want to pick areas where you suspect the greatest amount of outdoor exposure. You also want to pick the side of the house where you suspect the exposure is coming from. And then you want to focus on places like the exterior window or the exterior door frames, window sills, outdoor HVAC air intake vents, patio furniture, or porch rails. All of these are good places where you can get a reasonable amount of endotoxin activity. Now, it's really important to understand that dust testing, including endotoxin dust testing, is not a final verdict. It is an entry point to begin to understand the overall quality of your environment with respect to endotoxin activity. So you want to work with an environmental professional if your results are elevated or concerning. Preferably work with the CIRS literate indoor environmental professional or IEP. But if a CIRS literate IEP is not available to you or in your area, you want to at least try to work with an IEP that understands endotoxins and not just mold, right? And the other thing to think about here is that you can use dust testing, including endotoxin dust testing, to track changes over time, right? Following some kind of intervention, whether it's some kind of cleaning guideline or remediation, and that's going to give you a sense of whether your house is trending in the right direction or not in terms of endotoxin activity. To wrap up, we can say that endotoxins are an overlooked but critical driver of chronic illness, including CIRS, gut disruption that may include IBD, and neurodegeneration. The good news is, though, that we can measure endotoxins, and once we know what we're dealing with, we can take action and regain control over our health. So I'm going to leave you with this message. Assess your environment, take control of your health. Thank you, and thank you Envirobiomics for supporting this important work. For more information on how to order an endotoxin test, visit envirobiomics.com.